Namaskar and welcome back to this series of lectures on principles of construction management. And in the discussion today, we will try to close our discussion on legal aspects in construction. And what we will try to do is to go through some terms and phrases which are often encountered in legal parlance. And as I pointed out in another lecture, that the legal parlance is slightly different from normal language. And there are some very special terms which are used in very special context with a very special meaning attached there. So it's interesting to go through some of those words and understand the physical meaning of those terms as far as construction projects and construction management is concerned. So the first thing that comes to mind, or which is being brought up here, is the earnest money deposit. So the earnest money deposit is a deposit made to a client or the owner showing the bidder's good faith in a transaction. As far as real estate and similar transactions is concerned, earnest money allows the buyer additional time when seeking financing. So basically what happens is that if the buyer has to finally pay an amount of X to acquire an asset or to buy something or procure something, by paying a fraction of X, maybe 10% of that or 5% of that, that gives the buyer some additional time to arrange the additional resources, because the buyer may or may not have all the resources when he bids for the project. But the buyer is confident that, well, if I get the project, I will be able to arrange those resources. To express his good faith and seriousness as far as the bidding is concerned, there is the earnest money deposit, which is placed with the client or the owner, and once the job is awarded to the bidder, then the rest of the things follow. So that's what our discussion on the earnest money deposit is. Moving forward, retention money is the amount withheld for some time after the agreement has been fulfilled. Its purpose is to ensure that the contract has been properly performed by the service provider or the supplier. In contrast to that, the security deposit is the amount given by the depositor such that if he does not complete the task as per the work order, the owner or the client can recover the loss by forfeiting or using a part of this security deposit. As far as a construction contract is concerned at site, there is a situation that there is an ongoing work, a contractor has to do certain things, and now if the client asks the contractor to do a certain thing which the contractor is reluctant to do, does not do, and something else is held up or whatever it is, then the client would like to do it or have it done through an independent agency, and that cost which is incurred will be recovered from the contractor. And that is what is the process which is being said in para 2 here. That is, that the contractor is not doing something as per the work order, and the owner and client can recover the loss by forfeiting it or using a part of the security deposit. Whereas the retention money is after the contract has been completed and there is the issue that the project has been completed to satisfaction and continues to perform for a certain period of time beyond the completion time, that is, while the facility or the asset is in service. Then we have a bank guarantee, which is a promise from a bank or a lending institution that if a borrower defaults on repayment of a loan, the bank will cover the loss. Contractors often use bank guarantees rather than lock their own capital resources with the client. So this is true not even for losses or non-payment of loans, but also for any other item. For example, sometimes there could be a bank guarantee which would cover even security deposits. That is, in those cases, the clients can incur the expenditure and then invoke the bank guarantee, that is, ask the banks that this particular expenditure should be covered by the contractor, is covered by a bank guarantee, and therefore the banks should pay for it. Then there is this secured advance, which is an advance payment made to the contractor on the basis of security of materials brought by the contractor to the site of work under construction. So this is a specific advance. It's a special advance for material purchase. It could be for reinforcement, it could be for cement, it could be for any other material which could be very expensive and requires a special advance to be made before that material is actually consumed and paid for as a running account bill item. But please remember that any amount of secured advance that can be paid is only to the extent of the material that is likely to be actually used in the construction site. So, when making a payment for secured advance, one should be very careful and try to actually evaluate the advance being made as against the material that will be actually consumed at site. So, for that material, once it is brought to site, that advance is admissible and can be paid to the contractor. Then there is maintenance period and defect liability period. The maintenance period is the period following completion of a construction project during which the contractor is responsible for certain maintenance issues under the many building and engineering contracts. As far as the defect liability period is concerned, it is a set period of time after a construction project has been completed during which the contractor has the right to return to site to remedy defects. What is the difference between a guarantee and a warranty? As far as a warranty is concerned, it is a usually written contractual promise that attests to the quality of a specific purchased product for a certain amount of time. As far as a guarantee is concerned, it is also a promise regarding quality and may even be written into a warranty contract. However, guarantees are generally less likely to be written and are often not as clearly defined as warranties. Then there are two terms given here, penalty and liquidated damages and quantum meruit. As far as the penalty and liquidated damages is concerned, in a contract, the parties may name a sum to be payable in the event of breach. If the sum is a genuine pre-estimate of the loss, then it is called liquidated damages, and if it bears no reflection on the loss suffered, it is termed as a penalty. So, penalty and liquidated damages are both in the construction sites or in the construction contracts, they are both levied on the contractor for a breach of contract. That is, breach arising out of, let us say, not completing the project in time, not completing the project with specified quality, or whatever it is. If the penalty or the imposition is based on a genuine pre-estimate of the loss that occurs on account of not completion in time, non-conformance with quality, then it is called liquidated damages, else it is called penalty. The punitive nature is incorporated in the concept of penalty a little bit more than the liquidated damages. Then coming to quantum meruit, it determines the amount to be paid for services when no contract exists. That is, in other words, it refers to a reasonable sum of money to be paid for services rendered or work done when the amount due is not stipulated in a legally enforceable contract. In fact, some of these terms, if you look up the internet, the Wikipedia, or whatever it is, you will be able to find out enough information describing the terms, and that is exactly what I have done in fact, and also of course consulted a couple of legal books. The arbitrator and umpire, of course we have talked about arbitration as a dispute redressal mechanism. So, we have talked about what an arbitrator is, what is the qualifications of an arbitrator. So, in principle, an arbitrator is a person mutually agreed upon and selected by the parties to hear the dispute, and an umpire is a person chosen to decide a question in a controversy that has been submitted to arbitration but has not been resolved because the arbitrators cannot reach an agreement. So, this is another technical definition of an umpire. Then we come to some simple terms such as sub judice. Now, sub judice means that a particular case or matter is under trial or is being considered by a judge or court and has not been resolved. This has certain implications in terms of the fact that when a matter has yet to be proved or disproved in a court, the case is considered to be sub judice and should not be discussed or stated as a fact in public. What is the difference between an award and a decree, for example? An arbitration award or arbitral award is a determination on the merits by an arbitration tribunal in an arbitration and is analogous to the judgment of a court of law. It is referred to as an award even where all of the claimant's claims fail and thus no money needs to be paid by either party, or the award is of a non-monetary nature. As far as a decree is concerned, it is the ruling of the court regarding claims of the parties in the suit. The award can be speaking or non-speaking. That is something which we will see probably in a subsequent slide. Now, to close the discussion for the day, Let's try to understand some of the terms which I have not listed as definitions the way I have done for the previous ones, but we have tried to use them in a sentence. So, in a classical textbook style, let's try to understand and explain the underlined terms in the following sentences. So, the first sentence that we have is a non-speaking award. In a non-speaking award, the company was directed to make a payment of $5,000 US. So, what is a non-speaking award? A non-speaking award is an award where no reasons have been given. Contrast that to a speaking award where the arbitrator or the court gives the reasons for making a particular judgment. So, non-speaking award basically says that the decision is this, but it does not explicitly or clearly state the reasons involved. The next sentence, the judgment was set aside by a higher court. Now, setting aside means overturned. That is, if the court decides something, makes a award, a higher court, obviously somebody can go in appeal and say that I don't think justice has been done, and therefore if the judgment is upheld, then that judgment holds, and if it is set aside, it does not hold. The third sentence that I have for you is that the court directed that status quo be maintained. What is status quo? Status quo means the situation as it is. Suppose there is a dispute that there is a house and A was living in this house till a point T0. A goes out somewhere, and when he comes back after, let's say, T1, he finds that B is living in this house. So, what we are having is that at time T0, A is the occupant of the house. At a time after T1, B is the occupant of the house. Something happened between T0 and T1, and the ownership or the occupation changed from A to B. And now, if the matter goes to court at this point beyond T1 and the court directs that status quo be maintained, who continues to stay in the house? B continues to stay in the house, because at this point in time, who is the actual occupant? B. And therefore, if the court directs that status quo be maintained, B continues to be the occupant. As against this, if the court directed that status quo ante be restored and preserved pending decision, then what happens is that this is the status quo position. Before this change happened, A was the occupant of the house. Status quo ante refers to the situation as it existed before the present situation arose, and therefore, in that case, A continues to be the occupant. That is, in the previous case, it was B continues to occupy the house. In this case, A has to be given the occupation, B has to go out, but that does not mean that A or B become the owner of the house, and that is what is called sub judice. Till such time as the matter is decided, who continues to stay in the house is what is being covered in 3 and 4. After the decision is made, of course, the ownership will be decided whether A should continue to stay or B should continue to stay, or whatever happens to that house. So, that is an illustrative example of how status quo and status quo ante are used in legal parlance. And the last sentence, in a surprise move, the court delivered the decision ex parte. Ex parte means without the presence of or without hearing the second party. In court cases, we have a complainant and then we have a respondent. A claimant basically goes to court and files the complaint and names certain respondents, that is, against those people the complaint has been made, and these people then become the respondents. It is a principle of natural justice that before a decision is made, the respondents are also given an opportunity to explain or put forward their case, and therefore courts usually would not like to decide a matter ex parte, that is, without listening to or without giving a chance to the other party to put their case forward or be present at the time of the final decision. And therefore, it is an unusual situation when a court delivers a decision ex parte. Ex parte means without the presence of or without hearing the other party. So, with this, we more or less come to a close of our discussion on the legal aspects of construction projects, and these are some of the references which you could use to deepen your understanding of the legal issues, and I look forward to seeing you in the last couple of classes as far as this module is concerned. Thank you.